It was a bright Saturday afternoon, and Lily was playing soccer with her friends in the park. The air was filled with laughter and the sound of kids running around. Lily, an energetic and cheerful 8-year-old, was chasing the ball with all her might, determined to score a goal. Just as she was about to kick the ball, her foot slipped on a patch of wet grass. She fell hard, landing awkwardly on her leg. A sharp, searing pain shot through her, and she cried out. Her friends rushed to her side, their excitement quickly turning to concern. "Lily, are you okay?" one of them asked, kneeling beside her. Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "My leg, it hurts so much," she whimpered. One of her friends quickly pulled out a phone and called Lily's father, James. "Mr. Carter, Lily fell, and we think her leg is hurt. Can you come quickly?" James was in his office finishing some paperwork when he got the call. Hearing his daughter's cries in the background made his heart race. "I'm on my way," he said firmly, grabbing his car keys and rushing out. James, a successful businessman, owned a network of hospitals in the city. He had always been a hands-on father, balancing his work with spending quality time with Lily. Today, that balance was tested as he raced to the park to help his daughter. When he arrived, he found Lily sitting on the grass, holding her leg tightly. Her friends had tried to comfort her, but it was clear she was in serious pain. James knelt down beside her, his face filled with worry. "Lily, I'm here," he said gently. "Let's get you to the hospital." Carefully, James picked her up and carried her to the car. Lily winced in pain, but held onto her father tightly, feeling safe in his arms. On the way to the hospital, James spoke soothingly to her. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We'll get your leg looked at, and you'll feel better soon." They arrived at one of the hospitals James owned. He decided not to reveal his identity as the owner, wanting his daughter to experience the same care any other patient would. He carried her into the emergency room, where the receptionist looked up briefly before motioning for them to sit in the waiting area. "My daughter is in a lot of pain," James explained. "I think her leg might be broken." The nurse at the desk barely glanced at them. "Take a seat. We'll call you when it's your turn," she said curtly. James frowned but followed the instructions, sitting down with Lily in his lap. He could feel her trembling from the pain, and it broke his heart. Looking around, he noticed how busy the emergency room was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the nurse's dismissive attitude was uncalled for. Little did the nurse know, the man she had just brushed off wasn't an ordinary father. James sat in the crowded waiting area, holding Lily tightly as she whimpered in pain. He gently stroked her hair, trying to comfort her. "It's okay, sweetheart. They'll call us soon," he said softly, though inside, he was growing more anxious by the minute. The emergency room was busy, with patients sitting on chairs and others standing by the walls. The nurse at the front desk seemed overwhelmed, but her lack of compassion was noticeable. James couldn't help but notice how she barely acknowledged anyone who approached her. Lily shifted in his lap, wincing as tears streamed down her face. "Daddy, it hurts," she whispered. James clenched his jaw, trying to keep his frustration in check. He stood up and approached the nurse again. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "My daughter is in a lot of pain. Can we please see a doctor soon?" The nurse barely looked up from her computer. "I told you already, sir. You need to wait. We'll call you when it's your turn," she said dismissively. James sighed and returned to his seat, his mind racing. He knew the hospital was busy, but the nurse's attitude felt cold and unprofessional. As Lily cried softly in his arms, James's frustration grew. He wanted to demand better treatment but decided to observe for now. An hour passed, and still, no one had called them. James noticed other patients who arrived after them being taken in first. He watched as the nurse chatted casually with another staff member, laughing while ignoring the growing line of people waiting for help. James took a deep breath and approached the desk once more. "I understand you're busy," he said, keeping his voice calm. "But my daughter is in severe pain, and she's just a little girl. Can you please check how much longer we'll have to wait? The nurse sighed heavily, clearly annoyed. Sir, I don't control the doctors. You'll just have to wait your turn like everyone else. James felt his patience wearing thin. He looked at Lily, who was now pale and trembling, and knew he couldn't let this continue. Thank you, he said, his tone cool. He walked back to Lily, deciding he would escalate the issue if no action was taken soon. Meanwhile, other patients in the waiting area started to notice. A woman sitting nearby leaned over and said quietly, "They should have seen her by now. That poor girl looks like she's in so much pain." James nodded, appreciating the support. He was determined to stay calm and ensure Lily got the care she needed, but he couldn't help but feel disappointed. This was supposed to be one of the best hospitals in the city, a hospital he owned, and yet his daughter was being ignored. As he held Lily close, James resolved to take action. But first, he needed to see just how far this situation would go. Another hour passed, and James's frustration grew with each minute. Lily's pain was evident. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, and she clung to James as though holding on to him would make the pain go away. "Daddy, why aren't they helping me?" she asked in a weak voice, tears streaming down her cheeks. James's heart broke at her words. He hugged her tightly and said, "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you, we'll get you help soon." He stood up and approached the nurse for the third time, his voice calm but firm. "My daughter is in extreme pain, and she might have a broken leg. This is unacceptable. She's been waiting for 2 hours. Can you please make sure she's seen by a doctor now?" The nurse sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "Sir, we have a lot of patients, and everyone has to wait their turn. I can't make any exceptions." James clenched his fists, struggling to keep his emotions in check. This isn't about exceptions. It's about treating a child who's in visible pain. This is an emergency. The nurse gave him a dismissive look and went back to typing on her computer. "I already told you, sir. There's nothing I can do." James returned to his seat, his mind racing. He had chosen not to reveal his position as the hospital's owner because he wanted to see how the staff treated ordinary patients. Now he was seeing firsthand the neglect and lack of care that some patients endured. A middle-aged man sitting nearby leaned over and said, "I don't mean to pry, but they should have seen your daughter by now. This is not right." James nodded, grateful for the stranger's support. "Thank you," he said. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Lily let out a small cry as she shifted in her seat, the pain clearly worsening. James couldn't wait any longer. He picked her up and walked toward the nurse's desk again. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. "If you don't get a doctor for my daughter right now, I'll make sure this issue is escalated to the highest level." The nurse rolled her eyes. "Do what you want, sir, but like I said, you'll have to wait." James turned and walked back to his seat, his jaw clenched. He was done waiting. Pulling out his phone, he called one of the hospital administrators, someone he trusted to take immediate action. "Mr. Carter, is everything okay?" the administrator asked. "No, it's not," James replied. "I'm at the emergency room with my daughter, and she's being ignored. I need this resolved immediately." The administrator promised to handle the situation, and James hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. He looked down at Lily, her head resting on his shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy's taking care of it." As James ended his call with the hospital administrator, he felt a sense of determination. He had given the staff plenty of chances to do the right thing, but their neglect of Lily could no longer be ignored. He gently kissed the top of her head as she leaned against him, her little hands clutching his shirt. "Daddy, will they help me now?" Lily whispered weakly. "Yes, sweetheart," James replied softly. "We're going to get you the help you need very soon." Within minutes, the hospital administrator, Mr. Roberts, arrived in the emergency room. He was a tall man with a serious expression and carried an air of authority. Spotting James and Lily, He walked directly toward them. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the delay," Mr. Roberts said, his voice calm but urgent. He glanced at Lily, who was still crying softly, and his face softened. "We'll take care of her right away." Before James could respond, Mr. Roberts turned to the nurse at the desk. "Why has this child not been seen yet?" he demanded. The nurse looked startled. "We've been very busy, sir," she said defensively. "Everyone has to wait their turn." Mr. Roberts' expression hardened. "I've reviewed the logs, and there's no excuse for making a child with a suspected broken leg wait for hours. This is unacceptable." The nurse shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Mr. Roberts immediately called over a doctor and directed them to take Lily to an examination room. "Make sure she gets the care she needs, right now," he instructed. The doctor nodded and carefully led James and Lily into the room. James laid Lily down on the examination table, and the doctor began to examine her leg with care. "It looks like a fracture," the doctor said gently. "We'll get her an X-ray to confirm, and then proceed with treatment." Lily squeezed James's hand tightly. "Will it hurt, Daddy?" James smiled reassuringly. "It might a little, but you're brave, my love. I'll be right here with you." As Lily was taken for her X-ray, James stepped out to speak with Mr. Roberts. "I didn't want to use my position as the hospital's owner," James began, his tone measured. "I wanted to see how patients were treated without special privileges. What I saw was troubling." Mr. Roberts nodded. "I understand, Mr. Carter. This isn't how things should be. I'll conduct a full review of the emergency room staff and procedures. The nurse's behavior today was unacceptable, and we'll address it immediately." James took a deep breath. "Make sure this never happens again, to anyone. Patients deserve compassion and care, no matter who they are." As Lily returned from the X-ray and the doctor confirmed the fracture, James stayed by her side, holding her hand. She would soon be on the path to recovery, but James knew this was only the beginning of fixing a much bigger problem in his hospital. Lily was resting comfortably in her hospital bed after the doctor had carefully set her fractured leg in a cast. The pain medicine had helped ease her discomfort, and she finally smiled as James sat beside her, holding her hand. She whispered, "Thank you, Daddy. You made them help me." James smiled warmly. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll always make sure you're taken care of." As Lily dozed off, James stepped out into the hallway, where Mr. Roberts was waiting for him. The administrator looked relieved to see James, but also deeply apologetic. "Mr. Carter, I've taken the first steps to address what happened today," Mr. Roberts said. "The nurse in question has been suspended pending an investigation. I've also informed the staff that changes are coming, effective immediately." James nodded, his face calm but serious. "Good. What I witnessed today was not acceptable, Roberts. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every patient who walks through these doors. No one should have to wait in pain because of neglect or poor attitudes." As they spoke, the nurse from earlier rounded the corner. She froze when she saw James and Mr. Roberts, her expression shifting from nervous to confused. "Mr. Roberts, is there a problem?" she asked cautiously. Mr. Roberts stepped aside, and James spoke directly to her. "Yes, there is. You ignored my daughter, who is in visible pain. But more importantly, you ignored your responsibility as a caregiver. Patients come here for help, not to be dismissed." The nurse looked flustered. "I didn't know she was your daughter," she said quickly, as if that justified her actions. James' expression remained steady. "That's the problem. It shouldn't matter whose child she is. Every patient deserves respect and care, regardless of who they are." The nurse's face reddened, and she looked down, realizing the weight of her mistake. Mr. Roberts intervened gently but firmly. "You'll have a chance to explain your actions during the review process. For now, please take some time to reflect." After she left, James turned back to Mr. Roberts. "This isn't about punishment. It's about making sure this hospital lives up to its mission of compassion and excellence. I want training sessions implemented immediately to ensure all staff understand their roles and responsibilities. I'll take care of it, Mr. Roberts promised. Later that evening, as James sat by Lily's bedside, she woke up briefly and looked at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are they going to be nicer now?" James stroked her hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to make sure they're kinder to everyone who comes here." As Lily drifted back to sleep, James felt a sense of purpose. This was more than just a personal issue. It was a chance to make real, meaningful change in his hospital. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was ready to take the first step. The next morning, James arrived at the hospital determined to make things right, not just for Lily, but for all the patients who would walk through its doors in the future. After ensuring Lily was comfortable and surrounded by caring staff, he headed to a meeting with the hospital leadership team. In the conference room, the mood was tense. Senior doctors, nurses, and administrators sat quietly, waiting for James to speak. He stood at the head of the table, his calm but firm demeanor commanding attention. "Yesterday, I witnessed something that no patient or family member should ever experience," James began. "My daughter, a scared little girl in pain, was ignored for hours in the emergency room. This wasn't just a failure to treat her. It was a failure of our hospital's mission to provide care with compassion and excellence." The room was silent as James continued. "What I saw wasn't just about one nurse or one situation. It's about the culture we allowed to develop. A culture where patients feel neglected and where some staff forget why they chose this profession. That ends today." James outlined a series of changes he wanted implemented immediately. First, all staff would undergo retraining to reinforce the values of compassion, empathy, and professionalism. Second, additional personnel would be hired to ensure the emergency room was never short-staffed. Third, a new feedback system would be introduced, allowing patients and their families to share their experiences directly with hospital leadership. As he finished, James looked around the room. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort. Every patient deserves to feel valued and cared for, no matter their background or circumstances." The staff exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. One senior nurse spoke up. "Mr. Carter, I've worked here for 20 years, and I've seen how things have slipped over time. I think these changes are exactly what we need. Thank you for stepping in." James smiled slightly. "Thank you for your honesty. This isn't just my hospital. It's ours. Let's work together to make it the best it can be." After the meeting, James personally visited different departments, speaking with staff and encouraging them to share their thoughts. Many were inspired by his hands-on approach and felt motivated to do better. Word quickly spread that the hospital's owner had personally stepped in to ensure positive changes, and morale began to lift. Back in Lily's room, she was smiling as Emily, one of the nurses, braided her hair and told her funny stories. When James entered, Lily grinned. "Daddy, Emily is so nice. I like her." James chuckled. "I'm glad. Sweetheart, you deserve the best care." That evening, as James left the hospital, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but he had taken the first step. His goal wasn't just to fix what went wrong. It was to create a hospital where every patient, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, felt safe, respected, and cared for. As the weeks passed, the changes James had implemented began to take shape. The hospital staff underwent intensive training sessions, led by experienced professionals who emphasized kindness, empathy, and the importance of patient care. New staff members were hired to address the emergency room's workload, ensuring no patient was left waiting in pain. James frequently visited the hospital, not as the owner but as an observer. He walked through the halls, spoke with patients and families, and even sat in the waiting room to see firsthand how things were improving. Each visit filled him with hope as he saw progress being made. In Lily's case, her recovery was going well. She had grown fond of the nurses and doctors who treated her with care and warmth. Her bright smile returned as she adapted to her cast, showing off her colorful drawings on it to everyone who visited her. One afternoon, as James sat by Lily's bedside, she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, why did you make them change everything?" she asked. James smiled and held her hand. "Because, sweetheart, I want every child, every person who comes here to feel safe and cared for. No one should feel ignored, no matter who they are." Lily tilted her head, thinking, "Even if it's not your hospital." James chuckled. "Even if it's not my hospital, it's important to do the right thing, no matter where you are." Meanwhile, the staff began to notice the positive effects of the changes. Patients expressed their gratitude for quicker service and more attentive care. The feedback system became a valuable tool, helping leadership address issues before they became bigger problems. One day, James received a letter from the nurse who had ignored Lily that day in the emergency room. In the letter, she apologized sincerely, acknowledging her mistakes and explaining that the experience had been a wake-up call. She promised to do better, not just as a nurse, but as a person. James read the letter carefully, appreciating her honesty. He knew everyone deserved a second chance, especially if they were willing to grow. He shared the letter with Mr. Roberts and encouraged the nurse to continue her retraining. As the hospital continued to thrive, James found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He realized that his decision to step in as a father, not just as the owner, had made all the difference. It reminded him of the importance of humility and perspective. One evening, as Lily played with her siblings at home, James watched from the kitchen, feeling the deep sense of peace. The hospital was changing for the better, and Lily's recovery was a daily reminder of why he had fought so hard. "Daddy, look," Lily called, holding up her latest drawing. It was a picture of their family standing outside the hospital, all smiling. At the top, she had written, "My daddy fixes everything." James smiled, his heart full. "Not everything, sweetheart, but I'll always try." Months later, the hospital had transformed into a model of care and compassion. Patients and families often remarked on how attentive and kind the staff had become. The changes James initiated weren't just visible, they were felt by everyone who walked through the doors. Lily had fully recovered by now, her cast removed and her smile as bright as ever. She proudly showed off her ability to walk again, hopping around the living room to make her siblings laugh. "See, Daddy, I'm all better now," she said with a grin. James watched her with pride. "You've been so brave, Lily. I'm proud of you." One day, James decided to bring Lily back to the hospital for a special visit. As they walked through the halls, staff members greeted them warmly. Nurses and doctors who had been part of her care team came by to check on her and comment on how well she was doing. Lily, now more confident, beamed at all the attention. At the end of their visit, James asked to meet with the hospital staff in the conference room. When everyone had gathered, he stood at the front of the room, with Lily standing proudly beside him. "I wanted to thank all of you," James began. "Over the past few months, you've shown incredible dedication to making this hospital a place of care, compassion, and excellence. What happened to Lily was a wake-up call, not just for the hospital, but for me as well. It reminded me why I started this journey in the first place, to make a difference." The staff applauded, and some smiled at Lily, who waved shyly. James continued, "This isn't just about fixing what was broken. It's about setting a new standard. And you've all shown that change is possible when we work together." After the meeting, Lily handed out small thank you cards she had made for some of the nurses and doctors who had cared for her. Each card had a drawing of a heart and a simple message: "Thank you for helping me feel better." The staff was touched, and one nurse knelt down to hug Lily gently. "You're such a sweet girl, Lily. It was our pleasure to take care of you." On the drive home, Lily looked up at James and asked, "Daddy, do you think everyone will always be nice at the hospital now?" James smiled, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "I think we've made a big difference, Lily, and I'll keep working to make sure it stays that way." As they pulled into their driveway, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been worth it. Lily's strength and resilience had inspired him to fight harder, not just for her, but for every patient who walked through the hospital doors. That night, as Lily drifted off to sleep, James stood by her bed, watching her peaceful expression. He whispered, "You've taught me so much, my little hero. Together, we've made something better."